Good evening and welcome to another evening of the Standing Committee on Social and Economic Development. Can the committee please come to order? Our first item of business is the election of a chairperson. Are there any nominations? Are there any nominations? Yeah? Oh, sorry, I need to recognize you. Mr. Johnson.
I would nominate Mr. Panook.
Mr. Panook has been nominated. Are there any other nominations? Hearing none, Mr. Panook, will you please take the chair?
I guess now we'll nominate a vice chair, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good evening. Will the committee, Standard Committee of Social Economics? Okay. Oh, that, of course, he's already, our clerk has already gone that far. Our next item of business is electing the vice chairperson. Are there any nominations? The Honourable Minister of Climate and Conservation, or Ms. Guimard. Ms. Guimard, would you want to nominate the Honourable Mr. Johnson for Vice Chair? Can she hear us?
Can you just do a test to see if any member can hear us?
Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Can you put up your hand if you can hear me?
Okay, fantastic.
But Sarah can't. Mr. Altemeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I nominate the MLA for Assiniboia, Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Johnson? Okay. Mr. Johnson, you're vice chair.
Having been nominated.
Mr. Johnson has been nominated. Are there any other nominations? Hearing no other nominations, Mr. Johnson is elected vice chair. This meeting has been called to consider Bill number 45, the Public Schools Amendment and Manitoba Teachers Society Amendment Act. I would like to inform all in attendance of this provisions of our rules regarding the hour of adjournment. The Standing Committee meeting is considered a bill must not sit past midnight to hear public presentations or consider clause by clause of a bill except for unanimous consent by the committee. Written submissions from the following people for Bill number 45 have been received and distributed by the committee by the following members: Vanessa Lilick, private citizen; Maureen Furley, private citizen; Katrinka Stasina, private citizen; and Jerry Sodonak, River East Transcona School Division. And there's also a Lindsay Lodge, private citizen, Judith, Josh Rempel? Justin Rempel, private citizen, and Charlene Satcher, private citizen. Does the committee agree to have the documents appear on Hansard transcripts of this meeting? We need somebody to agree. Agreed and so ordered. Public presentation guidelines. Prior to proceeding with the public presentations, I would like to advise members of the public regarding the process of speaking in a committee. In accordance to our rules, a time limit of 10 minutes has been allotted for presentations, with up to another 5 minutes allowed for questions from the committee members. If a presenter is not in attendance when their name is called, they will be dropped to the bottom of the list. If presenters is not on the attendance and when the name is called a second time, they will be removed from the presenters list. The proceedings of our meetings are recorded in order to provide a verbatim transcript. Each time someone wishes to speak, whether an MLA or a presenter, I first have to say the person's name. This is a signal that the handset recorder to turn the mic on and mic off. Also, if a presenter has written materials for distribution to the committee, please send a file by email to the moderator, who will now distribute to all the committee members. Thank you for your patience, and we will now proceed with the public presentations. I will now call on first presenter, Alan Campbell from the Manitoba School Boards Association. Alan Campbell, if you can, okay. Okay, I asked the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on, please.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I just want to make sure.
First, I'll just call your name first. Mr. Campbell, you can do your presentation now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, committee members. It is with mixed emotions that I appear before you to address Bill 45. In doing so, I wear two hats. The first is a locally elected trustee from my community, and the second as president of our association, being elected by the community of school boards of Manitoba to bring their voice to such proceedings. For 150 years, school trustees in Manitoba have represented the employing authority for all staff who make a difference in the lives of our community's students and schools. From the days of the one-room schoolhouses through to the dawn of cyber academies and virtual schools, we have brought the employer relationship to the bargaining table with our teaching staff. One size does not fit all when it comes to education in Manitoba, and this also applies to the compensation, benefits, and working conditions that we strive to establish locally. Important distinctions in terms of community character, program interests, and regional economic diversity means that retaining the power to bargain with one's teachers, division by division, has provided this province with the most effective way to address local needs. It is ensured that, subject to a broad framework of provincial coordination, there remains sufficient allowance for each community to adopt those collective agreement provisions that serve their best interests. Bill 45 represents the discontinuance of this proud legacy, a legacy that has always ensured that Manitoba remains a destination of choice for teachers by way of promoting recruitment and retention that benefits our students and helps meet their academic and developmental needs. It is for this reason that the formal policy statement of MSBA in respect of human resources, as adopted through the democratic and collective voice of school boards province-wide, emphasizes that local bargaining ought to remain untouched. But the government has had ample time to consider the impacts of the path it is now choosing under Bill 45 and the oath that it has taken in respect of our province and its people. This last statement is the upper extent of the decorum that I can maintain regarding the full impact of what Bill 45 proposes to change. It is indeed a sad day for local communities across our great province. An important part of our social fabric and what makes us who we are in terms of communities welcoming and working side by side with their teachers will be forever removed under Bill 45. I have therefore said all that needs to be said in keeping with local democracy's final hurrah in matters of teacher employment authority should Bill 45 pass. This is where I will now remove my hat as an elected community school trustee and conclude my presentation as president of the Manitoba School Boards Association. According to this rule, I must concede before the committee that while our policy statements reflect a broad consensus as to what is and what should be, the statute that enables us, the MSBA Act, also provides that as a corporate entity, we shall at all times comply and conduct ourselves in keeping with the laws of Manitoba. Therefore, should Bill 45 undoubtedly pass to receive full assent and eventual proclamation, we as an association shall become bound by its provisions and shall work faithfully to implement those mandates and requirements. For no one is above the law and all are under the law. As I hope all members of this committee well understand, the exercise of democracy must be protected and prevail. This, for us, is a core guiding value. In this respect, our staff at MSBA have already invested a significant amount of time to conceptualize what the role of employer bargaining agent would mean, as is provided to our association under the Act. With the same professionalism and expertise that they have always bestowed upon our province, our staff at the association have conducted comparative analysis of how provincial teacher bargaining has been operationalized in other jurisdictions. They have drawn important lessons, models, and procedures from the Canadian experience and have brought forward options for further consideration. Not as endorsement for Bill 45, mind you, but at all times to ensure unfettered and unhindered service continuity across any legislative amendments that may apply to their work. This has been undertaken to guarantee their ability to remain always responsive to meeting the needs of our communities. Central to the options and procedures that our staff have explored has been the recognition that, until otherwise notified, school boards shall remain the employing authority for all teachers. As such, it is critical that any bargaining mandate that our staff receive when serving as agent reflect the traditional process that has always been used for everyone's mutual advantage. Staff believe that through the establishment of a representative steering committee comprised of regional and other interested representatives, such a model would strike a balance between local and provincial bargaining interests. Just as occurs in every other Canadian jurisdiction where school boards exercise local voice and local choice, the provincial bargaining process need not diminish local interests. Rather, it embraces them through carefully constructed structural mechanisms, as our staff have learned from their counterparts. Should the minister under Bill 45 thus extend the employee agent role to MSBA, please note that our staff are more than ready and have investigated the most practical way forward in this regard, one that brings all actors together with shared purpose to ensure that Manitoba's collective working environment for our students, teachers, teaching staff, and schools remains agreeable and strong. To conclude, what I will say is that in view of the parallel introduction of Bill 64, the Education Modernization Act, most of what is embodied under Bill 45 would be rendered inconsistent or to no force or effect upon the assent of that other act. As it is not the purpose of this committee to address that bill at this time, I will simply indicate that 10 minutes does not allow for a full clause-by-clause treatment of all that is drafted under Bill 45. Nor does it permit for a cross-referencing of provincial teacher bargaining provisions under both 45 and 64. Many challenges and questions concerning the cooperation of both statutes will be immediately noticeable by anyone who reads both drafts. To that end, our tabled written submission will, we believe, serve to provide additional observations pertaining to the specific clauses that appear in current form under Bill 45. We reserve our right to address Bill 64 at a later date and at another forum. As has always been true over the course of MSBA's 115-year history of service to Manitoba, our staff are further available to inform and research any matter or issue of consequence for public education. They are further mandated to cooperate with any Crown department in any project of mutual advantage. In keeping with our role to promote these causes, any questions you may direct to MSBA at the close of this presentation, we will take away and reserve for full written response following tonight's hearing. As staff in the Department of Education, indeed at the highest levels of the civil service, are no doubt aware, labor relations is a profession of highly technical sophistication. This was undoubtedly why MSBA was included under Bill 45 as a prospective employer bargaining agent. You are well aware that we did not seek this role ourselves and only came to learn of this intention when the bill was initially published. The role and responsibility of providing technical expertise and information therefore rightly falls to our association's labor relations and human resources professionals. Accordingly, you can forward questions to MSBA following tonight's hearing or ask them now, as our staff will note any questions you may have for further and later response. Thank you for providing an opportunity for the Manitoba School Boards Association to address this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell, for your presentation. And now we'll go on to questions for 5 minutes. And first question will go to the Minister of Education, Mr. Cullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Campbell, for your submission. I do look forward to your written submission as well. And I will just say that I look forward to future discussions in respect of Bill 45 and 64. So with that, thank you for your thoughtful presentation tonight.
Thank you, Minister.
Mr. Campbell, do you have a response, or do you want to add to it, or
No,
ask more any other questions from the committee? Mr. Altemeyer.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Campbell, for your presentation this evening. It certainly does paint a bit of a picture and gets us ready for what I anticipate will be some very interesting committee hearings when we get to Bill 64. Mr. Campbell, if you can expand a little bit more, you were talking about how this bill may impede the recruitment of professional staff in Manitoba. Can you talk a little bit about that a little bit more and kind of flesh that out for us?
Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question, Mr. Altemore. I think in terms of providing, I'll say a comparative analysis in terms of what we identify from a labor relations perspective at the association, we can certainly provide you more details in that regard. But what I would reference as the chair of a board who has a solid working relationship with the president of our local teachers association, and who can bring the needs of the local school community to the bargaining table, having been directly connected to the parents and the communities that our schools serve, the relationships that inform the local bargaining process in Manitoba today, and the community connections and mutual pride and mutual continued work for the good of all of our local schools in each of the communities that we represent, is something that will be lost with the passage of Bill 45. And when you consider that, I think for most of my trustee colleagues across the province, the local teachers association attends every one of our public board meetings, and we have the opportunity to engage with them in informal questions as a matter of the public question period, which is a standing item on every public board agenda. They have the opportunity to publicly engage with the board on matters of COVID-19, recognition of the work that senior administration teams are doing and the like. And when that local association piece in collaboration with the local school board is lost, so much of that important connection that informs the work that happens in public schools will be lost along with it.
Anybody else have a question for Mr. Campbell? The honourable member for Ms. Lamoureux.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you, Mr. Campbell, for your presentation and all the work you do with Manitoba school boards. And I really appreciate how you came to committee with both hats, being able to share some perspective from different sides as well. Now, you did start to answer my question in your last answer, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the work that goes between local communities being able to work side by side along with teachers, and just how that would be tangibly changed with this legislation.
Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question, Ms. Lamoureux. You're right, I touched on a bit of that in my last response. When you consider the programming that exists in schools, distinctively, or that is distinctive to the community in which the school resides, be it cultural programming or specific language immersion programming, be it some of the resources and programming that are in place for students with exceptionalities or with additional needs, all of that inherently locally derived knowledge, either from the elected representative who has been democratically selected to serve their constituents, or the teacher or the local teachers association, who are immersed, represent their membership, who are immersed in the delivery of that programming or in the execution on those resources that are made available by the local board. those two things complement each other very well. And I'm not here to paint a picture of local bargaining as a perfect, we don't all, we don't just get together and talk about how wonderful everything is. Local bargaining can be very difficult for all of the other reasons that I've also listed.
Mr. Campbell,
because when
your 5 minutes is up for questions.
I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for your presentation and the questions that you asked, that were asked by our members here on the committee. So now I'll call on the next committee member, the next presenter, Donald Nickel from Lakeshore School Division. I will ask the moderator to invite them to the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Mr. Nickel. Okay, there he is. Mr. Nickel, you can present, please.
Hello, yeah, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to join tonight. My name is Donald Nickel. I'm the Superintendent of Human Resources at Lakeshore School Division, and I've been asked by our board to speak on behalf of our region here tonight on Bill 45. So as a small rural school division, we serve a large, sparsely populated region. It's approximately the geographic area of PEI, and we have about 1,000 students enrolled. And we're acutely aware of both the challenges and benefits of being a small entity. And I think it's really led us to having a very personal and unique approach to education in our region. And at the core of our system is our teaching staff, who work really hard to put our students first every day. And over the past number of decades, our board has worked very hard and collaboratively with our local teachers association to develop a collective agreement that really reflects that relationship that we have, as well as the local area. And so there's certain language in our collective agreement that varies from other entities across the province. And we do feel strongly that we want to protect our ability to have our voice heard locally. And I think that it was appropriate that I followed on the presentation of Alan, who mentioned kind of those local needs and local interests. And when you take a look at the difference between a region of our size and our student population versus an urban region, there's significant differences in terms of our operational and educational needs. So while our board agrees that the teacher bargaining process can certainly be streamlined and there could be some efficiencies found there, there are concerns with certain language in Bill 45 that would effectively sideline the voice of rural areas. Of particular concern is Section 99.9, which talks to the voting process for employers' organization. And in this section, it lays out the process to follow if voting is required by the employers. And it stipulates that each district will have their voices weighted to reasonable effect, reflect the size of the unit of teachers for each member school division or district. In effect, because of the difference in numbers between urban and rural divisions, the fact that it would go by the number of teachers in each region effectively sidelines the voice of rural areas with low populations. So regardless of what system changes may be coming, and I understand, that there obviously, as Alan Campbell pointed out, there's likely some discrepancies here between Bill 45 and Bill 64. But we can say that whatever changes occur to teacher bargaining in the future, we would strongly recommend that the wording be made in such a way that rural areas have a voice in teacher bargaining, and that we have an equitable system of coming to the table. For example, each region could be allocated one vote by virtue of representing a geographical area, and then there could be an equal number of votes to the number of regions that are distributed according to the number of teachers. So both a popular voting mechanism as well as a geographic area allotment as well. So just wanting to highlight that as one of the concerns in Bill 45, and also just wanting to highlight that there is significant differences between rural and urban areas. And when we're looking at a single collective agreement being proposed for governing all teachers across the province, we need to make sure that there's allowances for those differences. Some key examples of that to kind of paint that picture in a clear light would be transfer agreements, for example. So if we're moving a teacher from one school to another school in our region, it's a very different situation than a division or district that's moving a teacher from one school to another in an urban area. And these things need to be reflected in a collective agreement. And I believe that it's important that rural areas have a voice in the process.
Thank you, Mr. Nickel, for your presentation. And now we'll go on to questions. And does any committee members have questions for the presenter? The Honourable Minister Collin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Nickel, for your presentation tonight on behalf of your board. Thank you for sharing your perspective. Obviously, from a rural perspective, and a small population-wise, but a large geographical area. I do appreciate your perspective on that. So thanks again for your time and presentation.
Mr. Nickel, do you have any response?
Thank you, Minister Cullen. I certainly appreciate that the time that you're taking to listen as well.
Well, thank you, Mr. Nickel, for your presentation and for kind of painting a picture for us of what Lakeshore School Division is like. I think sometimes that when we're in the city here, we kind of lose perspective about what's going on outside the perimeter and how truly unique some of the situations and circumstances are in our schools. And our schools certainly reflect our community. So can you just maybe tell us a little bit how your community is actually represented in some of the collective agreements that you have reached with your teachers?
Mr. Nickel.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think if you take a look at our transfer agreement, as I brought up a little bit earlier in section 12 of our collective agreement, there's some unique language in there. And I think that unique language is reflective of the fact that we've had an excellent relationship with our local teachers association over a number of decades. And it really speaks to a very collaborative process in that process. So if we have a need in our division where we need to bring, for example, a teacher from one community to another, the process there is that we need to look at our needs as a division, but then we're also consulting and entering a dialogue with that employee. And we've been able to make that work really effectively over the last number of decades. And, when you take a look at, once again, at urban areas, there's some differences in the wording and the language there. And I think that when it comes down to it, it's reflective of that relationship that we have with a smaller number of teachers, and also due to our larger geographical area.
Any further questions from the committee? No other questions? Ms. Lamoureux.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you, Mr. Nickel, for your presentation. And by the looks of it, you might be in a classroom right now. I really appreciate that you brought forward the recommendation of transfer agreements. And on that same note, I was wondering if you'd be able to recommend an amendment to the bill that would provide some confidence that voices for those who are living in rural areas will be heard and fairly represented.
Mr. Nickel?
Yes, there are a number of different systems that could be looked at. So if you look over to Saskatchewan, there's a mechanism where the province overall is responsible for some aspects of the collective agreement, and then there's another tier where boards are responsible for some other details. So that could be a system that could be looked at more, as well as what I mentioned earlier with just ensuring that if there is a employer voting mechanism, that there's a balance there between the rural areas and the urban, so that if there's a number of rural regions that collectively get together because their issue is very important to them, that when it comes down to a vote, that their vote counts. And so we need to have that balance, as many democratic systems have, between a popular vote and a vote for regions.
Is there any further questions from the committee? We have probably one more minute, and if there isn't any, thank you, Mr. Nickel, for coming and presenting today. We appreciate it. Now we'll move on to the next presenter, Jan McIntyre, Board Chair of the Prairie Spirit School Division, and moderator I will ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Ms. McIntyre, if she can. She hasn't been up on the Zoom yet.
No? Okay. We're going to
Okay. This is Ms. McIntyre. We'll bring it down to the bottom of the list. And now we'll go on to Sandy. Next presenter is Sandy Lethbridge from the Board of Trustees from St. James Assiniboia School Division. Ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Oh, Sandy's not on the video. Now we'll move down to the next presenter number 5, James Bedford from the Manitoba Teachers Society. Do we have James? Would the moderator invite them into the meeting, and please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Okay, we do have James here, Mr. Bedford. You can go ahead and have your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening to the committee. My thanks for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. My thanks also for the work you do on behalf of all Manitobans. So good evening. My name is James Bedford. I'm the president of the Manitoba Teachers Society. The society represents the 16,600 public school educators who work across the province of Manitoba. I'm here, of course, to speak on Bill 45, the Public Schools Amendment and MTS Amendment Act. The bill moves educators from a local to a single-tier provincial bargaining model. The Society has supported a provincial bargaining model for more than a decade now. However, this legislation includes an ability to pay provision, which we would consider to be interference in the collective bargaining process. 65 years ago, when teachers gave up the right to strike, we were guaranteed then a fair, independent, and meaningful interest arbitration process in exchange. The ability to pay provision reneges on that guarantee and threatens the sanctity of collective bargaining. Many teachers in Manitoba currently remain without a collective agreement for several years. This is the direct result of interference through Bill 28, the Public Services Sustainability Act. This bill was never proclaimed. In fact, it has been deemed unconstitutional by the Manitoba Court of Queen's Bench. Nevertheless, it has had a significant impact on the ability of teachers to achieve new collective agreements. Recently, the Education Department sent superintendents a letter indicating divisions must now obtain a bargaining mandate from Cabinet's Public Sector Compensation Committee prior to engaging in negotiations. It is fair to say that the government has established a pattern of behavior when it comes to suppressing the rights of teachers to free and fair collective bargaining. The ability to pay clause in Bill 45 is just the latest in a string of such attacks. The clause puts school divisions in the very unenviable position of making difficult choices about whether funds should be directed into student programming or towards staffing. We have said it once, and we will say it as often as what is needed. Teacher working conditions are student learning conditions, and they are interconnected. This means that funding one aspect while shortchanging the other will lead to negative outcomes for both teachers and their students. We're also concerned about the coming into effect date as it is stated currently in the bill. As written, local teacher collective bargaining will end upon the proclamation of Bill 45. This will freeze the terms and conditions of some teacher collective agreements as of July 1st, 2018, until succeeded by a provincial contract. We do not have a date for the commencement of provincial bargaining, but even after we have a date, it must be understood that the complexity of blending 37 local collective agreements into a single provincial agreement can take several years following that commencement of bargaining. While it is conceivable that salaries, allowances, and some other benefits could be bargained retroactively to the July 1st, 2018 date, this may be at a potential cost to other provisions within the provincial contract. working conditions, and rights could be frozen in place for years without some teachers having the ability to amend these or bargain new provisions in response to ever-changing workplace conditions. In effect, the ability of teachers to bargain working conditions and rights to address circumstances arising during these years would be lost forever. Taking away the right to bargain from teachers and simultaneously freezing the terms and conditions of their local agreements into place, the majority of which have expired on June 30th, 2018, for an indefinite number of years until a new provincial contract begins, effectively eliminates their right to use collective bargaining to address key employment issues. We know that Manitobans place great value on our public education system and that teachers play a crucial role in contributing to the success of that public education system. Teachers deserve the opportunity to negotiate fair terms and conditions of employment through a meaningful collective bargaining process. In fact, the Charter guarantees their rights to such. Based on this knowledge, we're calling on government to amend Bill 45, the Public Schools Amendment and MTS Amendment Act, by removing the ability to pay provision and making July 1st, 2022, the effective date for the commencement of a provincial collective agreement. I'll just add one thing that obviously wasn't in my script, and we've heard from several presenters, and I appreciate their presentations. Each one, be they superintendent, trustee, and now myself, will talk about the relationships that come with collective bargaining. And I wish to emphasize the importance of those relationships in any collective bargaining process. Certainly, they are appreciated by the teachers who work so hard across this province. Again, thanks very much for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Mr. Bedford, for your presentation. And now we'll go on to questions. Does any committee members have questions for the presenter? The Honourable Minister Collin.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Mr. Bedford, for your presentation. Appreciate your perspective. I do want to thank you and certainly all your members for their work over the past little more than a year on the COVID front. It certainly has presented us challenges when it comes to education, and we do appreciate all the work that your members are doing to keep both our students and all of our staff healthy through this. So I wish you all the best and your staff and your members in the future. So thanks again for your presentation.
Thank you for those comments.
Mr. Bedford?
We appreciate the understanding.
Mr. Altemeyer for the next question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation, Mr. Bedford. It's always a pleasure to listen from the people that are right on the ground, right? Working with our kids and right on the front lines of providing some of the excellent, not only just educational pieces, but also caring pieces for our kids. And that's, you know, something that sometimes we don't say enough of. So thanks again to you and your membership. I want to take everyone on a bit of a history lesson. This is the ability to pay provision in Bill 45 harkens back to the 90s. But last time we had this current government, last time we had a PC government, where they tried to also instill an ability to pay clause. I recall in May of 1996 leaving the MTS AGM from the corner of Portage and Main and walking down to the minister's office all the way over here on Broadway and raising our voice on this ability to pay. So here we are again now 25 years later, and still we have the same ability to pay clause. And nothing is more insulting to teachers, right? When we enter into this trust relationship with government, a trust relationship with our school divisions where the ability to pay comes in to cloud and impact that trusting relationship that we have with our teachers. And it's something that, for me, really kind of underscores this government's priorities. Can you, Mr. Bedford, just tell us, how do you see Bill 45 impeding the bargaining process when we're talking about something like good faith?
Mr. Bedford.
Thank you. Well, I think the expression, sir, is our boots have touched much of the same ground together. I recollect well the instances that you speak of. The ability to pay clause is a traditional interference mechanism within the collective bargaining process, because it's so terribly difficult to define. And in this case, with working directly with the provincial government or negotiating directly with the provincial government or their agent within provincial bargaining, it's very difficult to define what exactly is a government's ability to pay, because a government's ability to pay is directly related to a government's desire to tax. And some governments have a desire to properly fund all public services. Other governments have a priority to not tax or to reduce taxes. And should that concept, should that philosophy then be the one that drives whether or not you properly compensate individuals who make that proper decision, to make that decision to work in public service through their entire careers?
Okay, next question is from Mr. Johnston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question in regards to the ability to pay. You know, I'm certainly familiar with the discussions that have taken place on the ability to pay, but I was just curious in regards to, it's my understanding or it's been my experience that the local school boards have always indicated that that's a component that they wanted to be considered within the negotiations that took place between their locals and those school boards when they were in the process of negotiating. So I'm at a little bit of a loss here to understand why this seems to be only a provincial government's initiative, because as I mentioned, the local school boards, I believe, were very adamant that that be part of a consideration through conciliation and between arbitration. So perhaps you may want to comment on that?
Mr.
Well,
Bedford.
Thank you. I'm sorry to jump in so quickly. The landscape, of course, changes throughout the years, because and my experience at local collective bargaining backdates the election of the current government. Local school boards have for years and years have had the ability to tax locally, and therefore if there's a shortfall from funding from the provincial government, they turn to their local ratepayers and tax accordingly to their local ratepayers. My experience at the bargaining table has always been that those relationships, those conversations at the bargaining table focus around the work that's done within that local school division. And you find very quickly that there's a strong desire from communities and a strong desire from school trustees to maintain programming, but also to adequately compensate the people that work for them, the teachers, and quite frankly, all workers in the educational system.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Bedford, for your presentation and answering the questions. Your time is up for the 5 minutes, so we'll go on to the next presenter.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'll ask the moderator to invite the next presenter. The next presenter is John Weens, as a private citizen. Would the moderator invite them into the meeting? Please unmute yourself and turn your video on.
I don't know whether.
Oh, Mr. Weens, yes, we see, we hear you.
Okay, no, I'm actually not sure how I should turn my, okay, just wait, I got it.
There we go. We can see you, we can hear you. So Mr. Weens, you can start with your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You'd probably be just as happy if you couldn't see me, but anyway. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, committee members. I am, in a sense, representing myself. I am a private citizen. I was a superintendent for a long time. I have sat on both sides of the bargaining table at the local level. I have been the chair of the Teacher Welfare Committee for the Canadian Teachers Federation, and a longtime student of labor relations and of the ILO provisions for labor relations. I'm providing my perspective on a number of aspects of this bill, simply to have people understand things that they might not have thought about before. And I think to think carefully about some of the things that I believe that we might very well be losing with the passage of this bill. Manitoba, through my experience at the Canadian level particularly, but also at the American level, has been the envy of other provinces and of other jurisdictions. And one of the things that make us the envy of others is that we've had this amazing relationship with between school boards and teachers and senior administrators and teachers. We used to attend, you know, I'm dating myself, of course, but we used to attend Canadian Education Association meetings as groups from various school divisions and various school districts. And we socialized together at those things, and we in fact solved lots of the issues in regard to the relationships that we had at those meetings. So we might lose that. Now, I also understand, I think it's been mentioned earlier, that some parts of this bill seem to be moot, actually, in light of Bill 64. And I want to acknowledge that, but I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about that. I do want to say that virtually everywhere where we've had, and even in Saskatchewan, where there's a kind of a two-tier bargaining, when we've gone to a more centralized, a more formulaic, a more standardized provincial-wide kind of bargaining, we've seen increased militancy. And increased militancy has resulted in a number of things. One of them is that every minute of the day is bargained. You know, every minute of the day becomes a working condition. Every minute of the day when a principal or a manager or somebody wants to say, I actually want your attention to come and talk to you, is something that's bargained. And so in some cases, you know, in BC, for example, a staff meeting can only last for a certain period of time. When that time is up, teachers are basically asked by their Teachers Federation to leave the meeting. Doesn't matter what unfinished business there is, so on. The same thing is true when it comes to issues like noon hour supervision and other kind of supervision thing. Virtually every minute of the day is bargained, and the militancy actually extends way beyond the school and the classroom. It makes, in a sense, it makes enemies out of people. And that's one of the risks that we have with this kind of centralization agenda that we have at the present time. Now, I support collective bargaining, and I have been in management more of my career than I have been on the other side. But I support this because I would agree with some of the former speakers that what happens at the bargaining table is less about the money and more about the relationship all around. And I would use some examples of that. But those of you who have been involved in collective bargaining, like I have been for years, will know that we actually don't talk about money till probably the last 2 or 3 meetings, you know, in regular collective bargaining. We actually could have as many as 8 or 10 meetings talking about the issues that are important to teachers, that are important to the community, and sharing our different perspectives at the table on those kinds of things. And after we're done all those things and we can kind of get them off the table, that's when we started talking about the money. And which brings me actually to my next point. My concern is a democratic concern, that we have no replacement. In fact, we don't have a very good, we didn't even think about it very much. We have no replacement for the democratic discussion that takes place around the table in bargaining. We're reducing that. That space has been reduced over time, and it's being reduced even more in the bills that are in the legislature today. We're actually reducing the spaces where people can engage with each other about the things that are of mutual interest to them. We have enjoyed in Manitoba 100 years, a century, I would say, of labor peace, no strikes, stuff like this. This is very unique. And again, it makes us the envy of other people. And so I'm very glad that the arbitration system is still in place. But I do have to agree with some of the former speakers that this ability to pay clause is not just an unwelcome diversion, it actually never works. It's always not, it never was about ability to pay. It always was about willingness to pay. And that is what it does for me. With the introduction of that clause in here, in fact, suggests that we actually want to extend our bargaining process, make it more militant, make it more adversarial, because we all know in our heart of hearts that ability to pay has nothing to do with it. It certainly would have nothing to do with it in Manitoba at this point in time, nor in the history of Manitoba. We've always had the ability to pay. What we haven't had is the willingness to pay. And the fact that it keeps coming up is also a horrible distraction. It came up under Bill 72. There are other attempts under Bill 28. I mean, these things are actually, I think, a contradiction or close to a violation of the International Labor Organization agreement with the United Nations about free and unfettered collective bargaining. So I want people to think about that carefully. I think arbitration is really important, that we have a third-party arbitration, somebody who sits down and hears both sides and makes a decision and ensures that our students, our children's education isn't interrupted, their schooling isn't interrupted. I think that's really important, and I would hate to lose that. But I think we should also remove some of the other things which are actually just, they don't stand up, and they'll simply be bumps in the road and make the road bumpier than it needed to be. So I thank you very much for your time. I appreciate the time that you've given me. And I want to, of course, wish all of you well as a committee as you deliberate on this further. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Weens, for your presentation. Now, does the committee have questions for the presenter? The Honourable Minister of Colin.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Mr. Weens, for your time tonight. And thank you for sharing your perspective. Certainly appreciate the number of years you served in various areas in education, and respect your opinion tonight. So thanks again.
You're welcome.
The Honourable Mr. Weens, do you have anything to respond to the Minister?
No.
Or
just thank you.
Okay. Mr. Altemeyer for the next question.
Well, thank you for your presentation, Mr. Weens. We certainly learned a lot, and we know of your extensive experience both in the leadership capacity, and part of that leadership capacity, of course, was the ability to collectively bargain with local teacher bargaining units. Question I have for you is, how do you see the ability to pay clause harming that relationship with professional staff in school divisions?
Mr. Weens.
I think that the way it exists now does not throw a necessary roadblock or actually shut down discussion that would ordinarily take place. I mean, we use those words. I've heard them over and over again from trustees. I've perhaps even used them, though I don't think I have, perhaps even used them myself when I was on the management side and said, you know, our citizens, our community members don't feel that they wish to pay more at this point in time. So, and you have to take that in consideration. They feel that if we actually extend to you the things that you're asking for, that it will make their lives a lot more difficult. And I could go on and on about that. But but the point simply is that it throws a kind of wrench into this, into the free and collective bargaining, because actually it will never stand up in court. It will never stand up at a third party arbitration. It simply creates a distraction and a diversion and something that will extend negotiations because people will use their own definitions, in my experience with this, right? And just use it to block things that might happen otherwise.
Ms. Lamoureux for the next question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you, Mr. Weens, for taking the time to come out and present to committee tonight. It is clear the importance and role bargaining plays, and I appreciate that you can speak to that from both sides of the table. And, you know, you raised such an important point that there is no replacement for bargaining with this legislation. And that really resonates with me. And I guess I'm wondering if you have alternative ideas or amendments, or if you think it'd be better to sort of start from scratch here and reconsider this entire piece of legislation.
Mr. Weens.
You're opening a big door because I think that the government be well advised to look at lots of their legislation and rethink it. And actually, I would argue, quite frankly, as I have in other places, that they actually were not given leave to pursue some of the things that they're pursuing in the last election. You know, and so in answer to your question, I would say that it's not only this piece of legislation, but there are about 5 pieces of legislation that are on the books at the present time that actually stifle debate or attempt to stifle debate and dissent. And it's hugely problematic to me. I don't have any suggestions, you know, I mean, in that regard, I know that these things could die on the order table if certain things happen, but other than that, on some of these bills, I would take more time. On this one, I'm actually not sure. I mean, this is certainly not the most important one to me. Okay, but it's one more problem as far as I can see.
Mr. Weens, thank you very much for your presentation and answering the questions. Now we'll get on to the next presenter. I will now ask the moderator to invite the next presenter, which would be Liz Legal. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. From Pembina, Liz, is it Liz Legal from Pembina Trails Teachers Association? I would ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on.
Oh, hello, everybody.
How are you?
Actually am hoping to wait for the second round with your permission. Is that acceptable?
Okay, you want to go later? Okay.
Yes, please.
We could drop you down to the bottom of the list then. We'll move on to presenter number 8, Nancy Karpinski, a private citizen. I will now have the moderator invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Oh, sorry. Is there leave, like, first, before we get Ms. Karpinski on there, we have to ask for leave from the committee to drop Liz Legal down to the bottom of the list. Is it agreed to of the committee? Agreed and so ordered. Okay. So I'm wondering if Nancy Karpinski is, no, so we're going to drop Nancy Karpinski down to the bottom of the list. And next presenter number 9 is Ann Lindsay. I will now ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting, and please unmute yourself and turn your video on. And Ms. Lindsay, you can go ahead and Ms. Lindsay is actually from the Thompson Teachers Association.
It's not working. Oh, there we go.
We can hear you. Your video is now turned on. So Ms. Lindsay, you can go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Ann Lindsay. I'm speaking tonight on behalf of the Thompson Teachers Association. I have spent the last 35 years working at Artie Parker Collegiate up in Thompson. When I was asked to do this presentation, I promptly recruited the aid of former MNTS President Brian Adairn. While I will try and contain my remarks to Bill 45, I am unable to speak freely about provincial bargaining without also discussing local bargaining. The Thompson Teachers Association believes that if Bill 45 is passed, it will be detrimental to teachers, students, and local communities in the north and in rural areas. The Manitoba Teachers Society has their own beliefs for provincial bargaining, but I will mention now that the Thompson teachers have always voted against provincial bargaining. In many ways, this legislation evokes a strong sense of deja vu. It is very much like Bill 72 that another conservative government passed in the 1990s over outrageous objections from teachers and all supporters of fair and free bargaining. Which was one of the factors that led to the defeat of the government, and the legislation was eventually repealed. It is briefly worth reviewing the history of teacher bargaining in Manitoba. Back in the mid-1950s, teachers, after discussions with school trustees and the provincial government, willingly agreed to give up the right to strike in exchange for an arbitration process that would be binding on all parties. That system has proven to this day to be an unqualified success. In the nearly 70 years since the agreement was struck, the students of Manitoba have not missed a single day of school because of a collective bargaining dispute. Nor have teacher salaries and benefits spiraled out of control, remaining in the same relative place when compared to provinces that have endured lengthy and discouraging work stoppages. In the 1990s, the Philman government broke this agreement, instituting a system that's limited the scope of arbitration and imposing an unwarranted, ill-defined, and prejudicial system that allowed for the ability to pay to become a crucial factor in what was left of the arbitration system. Since employers normally claim they lack the resources to pay additional salaries, and many important areas were now excluded from arbitration, the legislation, for all intents and purposes, ended free and fair collective bargaining for teachers who never stopped fighting to have the legislation repealed. We fought in the courts, at the local level, and especially at the ballot box, insisting we would never surrender our rights to freely bargain collective agreements. The same can be true for teachers today. This current legislation disappointingly returns to these same themes, to the same effect. It seeks to eliminate the rights of teachers to a fair collective bargaining system by gutting the arbitration process that underpins it. In addition, the legislation also seeks to eliminate the process that allows for collective bargaining at the local level and imposes a system of provincial bargaining. This is an extreme and radical approach which will prove to be the detriment of teachers, students, and local communities. The disadvantages of provincial bargaining far outweigh the benefits. Obviously, it sacrifices issues of local importance for more global ones. Many rural and northern residents already feel that their interests are secondary to those in the major urban centers, and provincial bargaining can only inflame those concerns. But the problem created by this proposal goes far beyond rural and urban concerns. While bargaining may be contentious, the fact is the vast majority of collective agreements are achieved without arbitration being necessary. In and out of itself is valuable in that it allows for communication and understanding of the issues facing both teachers and locally elected trustees. Bargaining is an intensely human process, and eliminating local bargaining will destroy will destroy the single most important process teachers and trustees have to communicate openly and build respectful, trusting relationships. It's hard to build trust in your employer when they're an 8-hour drive away, and that's in good weather. If anything, provincial bargaining puts up barriers to open communication with our employers. Bargaining empowered teachers by allowing them to talk directly to their employers, making fair representation much easier to achieve. But there's no point in bargaining issues that aren't open in arbitration. And with a system of provincial bargaining, there will be no local bargaining at all. Bargaining has been one of the few processes that allowed school trustees and teachers to connect with one another. It has been one of the rare times where teachers got extensive access to trustees, interact with them, and had the opportunities to make the concerns known. It also gave teachers a chance to understand the concerns and issues that faced trustees. Relationships were built through the bargaining process. Trust was developed, respect was built. Collective agreements are not just more likely to reflect local issues when they are bargained locally, they are also more likely to be respected and adhered to when they bind people who actually negotiated them. An agreement hammered out in Winnipeg will not receive the same attention, respect, or compliance as one that was hammered out at the school board office over many hours of discussion. Such agreements will represent one more decision made by those who know little of and care little about those outside the perimeter. This assessment is made frequently and is often unfair to those charged with making decisions, but it is a common perception and it is not always wrong. And provincial bargain will only extend that perception. If all teachers are paid the same and have the same benefits, then there will be major problems attracting teachers to the north. The days when teachers were in their profession to make a difference in a child's life and to serve society have been over for many years. This generation may want to make a difference in a child's life and serve society, but they also want to see the value they're getting, how they are valued, the money and the perks they're being offered will outweigh the disadvantages of working in the north. It is difficult to understand why this government has chosen to reignite the anger and outrage of teachers and supporters of collective bargaining, especially with legislation that is eerily similar to legislation passed, bitterly fought over, and then repealed 2 decades ago. People under attack seldom respond passively, and teachers have already demonstrated that they will never surrender their ability to bargain their salaries, benefits, and working conditions. Refighting such battles not only seem futile, but ridiculous. On behalf of the Thompson Teachers Association, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to make this presentation and for listening.
Thanks, Ms. Lindsay, for your presentation. And now we'll go on to questions. Does any member from the committee have questions? The Honourable Minister Colin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Lindsay, for your presentation. Obviously, unique circumstances in northern Manitoba. I hope all is well in Thompson. I do look forward to getting back to Thompson, hopefully in the very near future. Just ask that you pass on my best to members of your association in Thompson. So thanks for joining us tonight.
Mr. Altermeyer with a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation this evening, Ms. Lindsay. I learned a lot about it, simply because you bring that northern perspective, and often, you know, we don't get that perspective again, like I said earlier, outside the perimeter highway. I want to ask you, as a teacher with some experience in the system and that has experience both at the bargaining table and in the classroom and in association work, You talked about a damaged relationship with this government. I want to ask you, what can this government do to begin repairing the relationship with teachers?
Ms. Lindsay?
This is going to be a personal opinion only. This government, in many ways, felt like they were treating teachers with contempt. You will do this for the good of society. When I read in the legislation about teachers should remember that they are there to serve society, and that when they're bargaining, things like economic conditions, the ability to pay, and we should remember that we're not there for money, power, or prestige. That's insulting. We do what we do because we like it. And everyone, as a teacher, can experience the joy of when a student understands something they've been struggling with. But words like that just make me see red. The same can be true of politicians, but I don't hear anybody legislating them to remember that they're there to serve society and they're not there for the money, the power, prestige. It is, and it's not only teachers, it's the way we all seem to have been talked down to, not just teachers, but nurses, hydro workers, Manitoba government employee unions, anybody affected by the illegal legislation that tried to freeze wages. That was an insulting. If personally, you get rid of Bill 45 and make changes to Bill 64, I'd be willing to talk to you. You would gain my respect. But Bill 64, I'm not against revisions to education. I think there are parts of education that are long overdue. But taking away local bargaining and local school boards is not the way to go about it.
Ms. Lamoureux has a question. Ms. Lamoureux.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you, Ms. Lindsay, for your presentation and just the sincerity, especially with that last question and answer there. I think that that human component of committee is extremely, extremely important. So I just want to thank you for that. And then just more of a comment, and I guess another thank you is for putting on our radar that there was similar legislation to this in the past. It's the first time that's actually been put on my radar, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Ms. Lindsay.
Thank you. I'm probably why I got chosen to speak, because I can be opinionated. And as they say, the closer you get to retirement, the less likely you are to watch your tongue.
One more question, Mr. Lamoureux. Mr. Altemeyer.
Well, thank you, Mr. Deputy Chair. Ms. Lindsay, you talked a little bit about the difficulties of recruiting professional staff up north. Can you provide a concrete example of when you can't find a professional staff, what happens in a school, especially in a large school like R.D. Parker?
Ms.
Lindsay,
I have to address you first. Ms. Lindsay, you got about 20 seconds, and if you go ahead.
Okay. In our vocational department, we were unable to get qualified teachers in many of the areas. We have hired professionals who have the Red Seal and are currently working on their vocational teaching certificate.
Thanks, Ms. Lindsay, for your questions and your presentation and answers. Our time has run out for questions. And before we do, okay. We would also like to, I was also wanted to advise the committee, we've also received written submissions from the following people for Bill 45. The moderator will distribute the electronically copies of all virtual committee members and hard copies for all members present in this committee room. And these are the following people: is Jay Ewert, Evergreen Teachers Association, Marcella Cabanzas, Louis Riel Teachers Association, Lindsay Vieira, private citizen, Rowena Larvarvias, private citizen, Julie Ching, private citizen, Nicole Peak, private citizen, Cameron Watson, Pine Creek Teachers Association, and William L. Taylor, private citizen. Does the committee agree to have these documents appear in Hansard transcripts for this meeting? Agreed and so ordered. So now we'll move on to the next presenter. And the next presenter is number 10, Sean Giesbrook, private citizen. And now the moderator will invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Pardon me? Oh, Sean, apparently Sean's not attending. So now we'll move on to presenter number 11, Chance Henderson, Mountain View Teachers Association. With the moderator, please invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Mr. Henderson, now you can present your presentation.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for allowing me the privilege of being here today. It's an honor to present committee on this important matter. I am Chance Henderson. I am an educator for the past 13 years of my life, and I am the president of Mountain View Teachers Association. I'm also a parent. My children go to school in this very same division in which I teach. On behalf of my membership, I wish to share with committee that essentially our main objection with Bill 45 is the ability to pay provision that is within the bill. We are concerned that this provision does not address the real ability to pay. Rather, it defines the ability to pay based on terms of what a school board or potentially the province would be willing to take and spend. When we take a look at collective bargaining, a critical piece to a fair and open bargaining system is an open and unbiased independent arbitration process. As you're well aware from what's been stated by other presenters here this evening, arbitration for teachers within this province is the only dispute resolution process that we do have available. And it is imperative that this process essentially remain virtuous. As long as the definition of ability to pay is not changed within this legislation, these provisions effectively remove teachers' rights to bargain collectively and replace this right with the employer's ability to impose salaries and working conditions under the guise of bargaining. So at this point, what I would just like to do is I'd like to share a story of one of our members. In preparation for this presentation, I took it upon myself to talk to a number of our teachers regarding the impact of Bill 45 and what having access to fair and open collective bargaining through our union effectively has meant to them. And one story that resonated the most with me was actually that of a teacher who joined our ranks effectively midway through their adult life. What they had expressed to me was that 2 weeks into their new profession, they came to a very deep and profound realization. When we take a look at where this member was prior, this member was working in an industry where effectively, the member was defining their worth by what they produced per hour, and the reason why they transitioned to education was because they felt that education provided them an opportunity to take and provide something more, greater service to community. And what they realized 2 weeks in was that in effect, because of the working conditions that were established within the collective agreement, because of the salary that was established, they were freed up to take and focus solely on the needs of their students. They were liberated to the point where through a 2 week period, they weren't concerned with matters with respect to the well-being of their family, the well-being of their home, they could focus on those matters that were pertinent to their students, whether they be matters that related to education or whether they be matters that relate to the social emotional well-being of kids. And speaks in speaking to that member, the one thing they referenced was very similar to what the Honorable Mr. Altamir had referenced. And that was the fact that when you look at the history of the Manitoba Teachers Association, we have had 100 years of labor peace. And that is primarily the result of the fact that we've always had access to binding arbitration that was fair and open in scope. And it was effectively that promise that is extended by our employer, by our government to our teachers. It was that promise that enables teachers to take and carry on the duties and the service that they take and they provide our students in our communities day in, day out throughout the year. And furthermore, when you look at that and you think of that, you know, that point of reference that member was speaking of early on in their career, that was prior to what we've seen over the past 2 years. When we take a look at COVID right now, we take a look at the exceptional efforts that teachers are having to make. You know, part of their ability to take and meet those needs and to take and achieve these things that we are during COVID, finding effective means to educate our children through these challenging times, that is all based off of the foundation of which is collective bargaining, what establishes our working conditions and what establishes our salaries. At the end of the day, we cannot deny that the working conditions of teachers and their salaries, in effect, also by extension influence the learning conditions of students in our classrooms. And all we really ask with respect to Bill 45 is that the right to binding arbitration, that it not be influenced by outside factors, that essentially we have the opportunity to still access arbitration that is open, fair, and independent, so that we can arrive at agreements that are and settlements that are fair to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson, for your presentation. And now we'll go on to questions, and the Honourable Minister call in for the first question.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Henderson, for your presentation tonight and joining us. Appreciate your perspective, and also appreciate the story of one of your members. I will just say, again, thanks for joining us, and certainly pass on my best to your members. Thank you.
Mr. Altamir on a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Henderson, for your presentation. You know, it's always great to hear from, again, the teachers that are outside the perimeter highway to give us that perspective from rural Manitoba. I know that rural Manitoba takes a great deal of pride in their community schools because, you know, community schools and schools are the one common experience that we have left in our society here in Manitoba, the one thing that we all experience. And I believe a community's best interests are served by very good schools. And thank you for you and your members for providing those very, not just very good experiences, but also the very good relationship building that your members do. So based on your experience then, Mr. Henderson, being at the bargaining table and seeing what you've seen from this current government, what type of employer do you think that this Conservative government will be for the teachers?
Mr. Henderson.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Mr. Altamir. To be honest, you know, I would be hopeful that they would be one that would be fair and reasonable. But unfortunately, the actions of this government, whether they be through Bill 28, whether they be through interference in the process of fair and open collective bargaining, when we speak of the University of Manitoba Faculty Association, whether we're talking about the Winnipeg School Division bus drivers, or whether we're looking at the most recent situations that we see with respect to the IBEW, Manitoba Hydro Workers, and the interference in government with respect to their bargaining, or for that matter, the recent mandate letters that came out, which essentially have terms that effectively mirror what's in Bill 28, it makes it very difficult to be optimistic.
Are there any other further questions for the presenter? Ms. Lamoureux.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you, Mr. Henderson, for your presentation. I really appreciated that you consulted with other teachers as well before coming to committee tonight so that you can share perspectives of many people. I was just wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about if you feel you were consulted with respect to this legislation or at all over the last couple of years that may have had an impact on this legislation.
Mr. Henderson.
Well, I can speak in very broad terms. I mean, specifically to the with respect to legislation, you know, obviously, you know, MTS would be the ones that would be taking the would be working forward with government on these pieces, and I hope that there would have been extensive consultation on the part of government with MTS. But just with respect to my experience, when I take a look at the totality of where things are at today. I don't know if within the education review there was enough teacher voice reflected. When I take a look at recent announcements by this government with respect to consultations that will take place with respect to the BEST initiative, I'm not certain that teachers' voice will be loudly heard through this process. I am hopeful that it will be, and I firmly believe that it needs to be. We as teachers, we are best positioned to inform government with respect to the needs of our classrooms and the needs of our students. And furthermore, you know, we are fierce advocates for our students, and we stand ready to take and you know, share our thoughts. We stand ready to take and collaborate to working forward as we look towards building a better education system for all.
Mr. Henderson, thanks again for your presentation. Your time has run out for the questions, and thanks for coming here tonight and to present. Now we'll move on to the next presenter. Well, the next presenter, number 12, is Kelly Friesen, and because she's having some difficulties with her technology, she's asked the approval from the committee to have a written submission that she's going to include into Hansard so that we can have it on record. Is it will of the committee to allow her to put it onto Hansard? Agreed and so ordered. So now we'll move on to presenter number 13, Greg Walker, private citizen. And now I will ask the moderator to invite him into the meeting. And please unmute yourself and turn your video on.
Greg isn't on the call right now, so we're dropping to
Okay, so Greg's not on the call right now, so we're going to drop Greg down to the bottom. So we'll move on down to Anna Marie Conigolio, private citizen. If I pronounce it right? Conigolio? Okay. Ms. Conigolio, you can present now. Oh, we don't have any audio.
Can you hear me okay
There, we
now?
can hear you now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go
Good
ahead.
Evening, okay. Good evening, committee members. My name is Anna Maria Canelio, and I have been a teacher for the past 16 years. And now I am a guidance counselor, and I've been a guidance counselor for the past 4 years. My concern with Bill 45 is that it changes the way that teachers bargain. It moves teachers from the current system of local bargaining, and I'm not on the bargaining committee, to a single tier model of provincial bargaining. Where are the voices of the teachers in all of this? So this is why I have chosen to speak against this bill. I'm trying to understand how a single tier model of provincial bargaining is open and unbiased and includes what teachers are facing every day. And I see it because I am in the schools, and I have been for the past 20 years. Teachers have not received any wage improvements in almost 4 years due to Bill 28 freezing the wages of all public servants. COVID-19 has added significant challenges to the educational system, and its effects will be felt for many years. And that is from now into the future. This provision will negatively impact the public system at a critical juncture, and the continuing
Ms.
downward.
Galileo, can I get you to just move your camera? Sorry for interrupting you. If you could just move your camera right way, we can't see you. You're just, yeah, if you don't mind, we can see all of you then. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Okay, so I was talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, teacher workloads have increased significantly and burnout is on the rise. Nearly 50% of educators responded to an MTS poll that they have seriously considered retiring. I'm not quite there yet, and I don't know if I will be anytime soon, but with the way things are going, it's definitely an option I would consider. The public education system is already under stress when it comes to the availability of qualified and certified teachers. Teachers leaving the profession or retiring early would lead to a dramatic teacher shortage. And education is an investment that pays for itself in the long run. Refusal to pay teachers competitive wages compromises the value and quality of public education and the future of our province. I want to speak a little bit about why I became an educator. And by no means am I aware, or was I aware at the time, of what my salary included. I started at the age of 21, and I worked until there is no time. Yes, there is a time frame when you are in the schools, but if you've ever been into a school, I can almost guarantee you that there are educators that are staying well beyond the hours that are required, whether it's doing extracurricular, whether it is preparing for the next day, the next week, the next month. Our educators are working above and beyond, and it's not just their time, it's because they care. They have a genuine passion and a desire to teach our children. And I am so lucky to be a parent of 4 beautiful children who are in our educational system. And I see it. I see the pandemic is taking its toll, not just on our educators, our children, our future. And it brings me back to this Bill 45, where our teacher voices need to be heard. We need to be heard. Collective bargaining allows for our teachers' voices to be heard. My question is, in provincial bargaining, will teachers' voices be heard? Do I have to take the full 10 minutes? I don't want to take the full 10 minutes.
Oh, that's fine. Thanks, Ms. Galileo. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now we'll go on to questions, and we'll have the Minister, Honourable Mr. Collin.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Ms. Galileo. We appreciate your presentation. Appreciate your passion for teaching. And I know of what you speak when you talk about teachers being committed. I'm surrounded by a family of educators, and I know the passion and the time that they spend on work on behalf of their students. So thanks for what you do, and keep up the great work. Thanks.
Thank you.
Mr. Altamar.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Cornelio, for your presentation. Again, I'm learning a lot about the contemporary experiences going on in our schools right now. Because certainly when I stopped working in the school system in December of 2018, it seems like an eternity ago. And I know that hearing you and hearing your presentation this evening has certainly brought me up to date. A question I have for you is, can you talk a little bit about the challenges that you're facing every day at school, and whether or not you felt supported by this current government regarding those challenges?
Ms. Conegalio.
Every day is a challenge from entering the building with this pandemic happening right now. That is a huge challenge, not just for myself as an educator, but I see the fear in our students who so much want to be there, who want to learn, but are afraid of getting sick, afraid of getting others sick, afraid of going out, but want to learn so badly. And the remote learning is not working for a majority of our students. They're not being supervised. They're not getting the interaction. That human relationship is so important. That interaction with each other is so important. But the fear of this pandemic right now is huge. We're seeing our class sizes increase, where at one point, especially in the early years, they were capped so that we could focus on literacy and numeracy and bring together. I don't know if you know just how many behavioral issues and concerns exist in any classroom, but I challenge each and every one of you to go and visit a classroom and spend the day or two or even a week to see how one educator works with 30 plus students. That in itself is a challenge, or how to keep them all separated during this pandemic, that not to touch the other person or to keep their masks on, or it's quite interesting to see how things are going. Do I feel like I am supported by this government? I'm going to give my own personal opinion. No, absolutely not. And I honestly believe that this bill does not consider teachers or teachers' voices, and we are not being heard. And this is not just on behalf of myself, but on behalf of staff members that I work with and for as well. As a guidance counselor, I am the ears, the eyes as well. And I am now speaking the voice. And that is not just my voice.
Mr. Johnston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Anna Marie. I'm not going to try your last name because I can see I can have a difficult time pronouncing it, but I appreciate your presentation very much. There was a comment that you'd made that I just wanted to address. You said, well, who's going to be bargaining on behalf of the teachers? Well, your MTS union, under the proposal or under this legislation, would be the bargaining unit on your behalf. And I suspect that on many occasions now, when the bargaining process takes place within your local, MTS representation, provincial representation, is no doubt very supportive of advising your union or your local in regards to the positions they take. So I think that the security in regards of long-term negotiation under this bill is not going to change that drastically, because your union, MTS, will be your negotiator and look after certainly your interests. The other component I just wanted to briefly speak on, and there's been a number of speakers that have sort of alluded to, is that that the bargaining process is somewhat unfair because of the ability to pay. And
Mr. Johnson, if you want to just continue your question, we're almost running out of time here. So
okay, all good. So I'm just basically saying is that the arbitration process is there, but the arbitration process was faulty because what happened was that an arbitrator would set a precedent with one school division, and that would be the precedent for all school divisions. So therefore, that independence that's being discussed here really wasn't there, or isn't there. So I just wanted to make those points. Thank you.
Time. So we ran out of time, and thank you very much for your presentation and being with us tonight. Now we'll go on to the next presenter. Next presenter on the list is Kevin Rebeck from the Manitoba Federation of Labor. I will now ask the moderator to invite him to the meeting, and please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Mr. Rebeck, you can go ahead with your presentation.
Great, thank you. Good evening, Chair, members of the committee, and other speakers. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the staff of the legislative committees. I've made several presentations the last few days, and I know they're working hard behind the scenes in challenging times to have these meetings go smoothly, arranging them, providing support, giving notice, making evening calls, and working hard on all of our behalf. So thank you, Tim, Katerina, and the rest of the Ledge staff for your hard work and help. It's appreciated. Now on to Bill 45. I'm speaking on behalf of the Manitoba Federation of Labor, Manitoba's central labor body, representing the interests of more than 100,000 unionized workers in our province. The MFL has consistently opposed this government's attempts to interfere in free and fair collective bargaining for public sector workers in our province, and will do so again here tonight. We support the Manitoba Teachers Society and their concerns with this bill. As you know, in exchange for giving up the right to strike, Manitoba teachers have a guaranteed right to a fair, independent, and meaningful interest arbitration process. This right is set out in law. This bill would interfere in the binding arbitration process and threaten the collective bargaining rights of teachers. I want to start off by thanking teachers and school support staff for their dedication to students throughout this pandemic. They've truly gone above and beyond for students and working families, and our province are better off because of their efforts. Like all workers, teachers have the right to meaningful collective bargaining with their employer. This right was affirmed last summer when the Court of Queen's Bench struck down this government's unconstitutional wage freeze legislation. The judge referred to it as draconian. Imposing restriction on the arbitration process for teachers is just another attempt by this government to interfere with free and fair collective bargaining. This government's chronic underfunding of education, coupled with restrictions on the amount of funds that can be raised through property taxes, has weakened the revenue base for school divisions. Furthermore, it has put school divisions in the unenviable position of making tough choices about whether funds should be directed into student programming or towards staff. Since working conditions and learning conditions are interconnected, funding one aspect while shortchanging the other will negatively impact student outcomes. In short, the ability to pay definition in this bill does not address the economic or fiscal capacities in the education system. Instead, it speaks to this government's willingness to pay, a willingness reflected in its ideological preference slash revenue available to schools, providing less resources than needed for students, teachers, and school support staff. This bill would potentially limit the salaries and benefits of teachers to the amounts predetermined by a division or district's budget, a budget largely determined by the provincial government before any collective bargaining has taken place. This would amount to interference in the arbitration process, as it would impose an obligation on the arbitration board to consider the willingness to pay. We support the MTS in calling for the withdrawal of the obligation to take ability to pay into account. Otherwise, this provision would effectively remove teachers' right to meaningful collective bargaining and replace this right with the employer's ability to unilaterally impose salaries and working conditions under the guise of bargaining. This government seems to have an obsession with suppressing workers' right to free and fair collective bargaining. The ability to pay clause in Bill 45 is just the latest in a string of attacks. We also support the MTS and their concerns with the timeline of this bill coming into effect. Bill 45, as currently written, would effectively end local teacher collective bargaining upon its proclamation, possibly as early as June 1st, 2021. This means that following proclamation, no collective bargaining will occur until the MTS and the government representatives at a provincial table commence negotiations for a provincial collective agreement. Except for 6 collective agreements, Louis Riel, Pembina Trails, Beautiful Plains, Southwest Horizon, and Frontier, the effect of Bill 45's proclamation would indefinitely freeze the terms and conditions of 31 teacher collective agreements from July 1st, 2018, until succeeded by a provincial contract. The commencement date of the provincial negotiations is unknown, and given the complexity of blending 37 collective agreements into one, it's likely such a process will in fact take several years following the commencement of bargaining. Taking away the right to bargain from teachers and simultaneously freezing the terms and conditions of their local collective agreements into place, the majority of which expired on June 30th, 2018, for an indefinite number of years, would effectively eliminate teachers' right to use collective bargaining to address key employment issues. Teachers do work that's of tremendous value to young people, working families, and our society as a whole. Like all workers, they deserve a meaningful collective bargaining process, along with a fair and independent arbitration procedure. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees their right to such. We echo the MTS's call to amend Bill 45 by removing the ability to pay provision and making July 1st, 2022 the effective date for the provincial collective agreement. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Rebeck, for your presentation. And now we'll go on to questions. The first question from Minister Cullen. Mr. Cullen?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Mr. Rebeck, for joining us tonight. Haven't had a chance to have a conversation with you for quite some time, Kevin, and I just want to say thanks for joining us and thanks for sharing your perspective tonight.
Mr. Altamir for next. Oh, there was a response from Mr. Rebeck to Mr.
Sure, I just say I appreciate that and thank you for the opportunity to come speak. I hope you'll listen to the concerns being raised and make amendments to this bill. It would mean a lot for the Teachers Society, for teachers, and the education system in Manitoba.
Mr. Altamir has a question, the second question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rebeck, for your presentation. And then please extend my thank you to your members for all the work that they've been doing during this pandemic. I know many MFL members are frontline workers and have been enduring quite a bit and have had to deal with a lot of stress, especially now that we're entering into a possible third wave. A question I have for you, Mr. Rebeck, is, based on your extensive experience at the bargaining table, how do you feel this bill will impact that really important collective bargaining process?
Mr. Rebeck?
Thank you. This bill will damage that process in a significant way. It'll remove a forum for teachers and their representatives to get together with employer representatives and have in-depth discussion. Right now, there's 37 of those conversations that happen on a regular basis. To relegate that to one table and trying to merge all of those agreements will have a lasting impact and a damaging one on labor relations in the education system. This bill is going about things the wrong way. It's putting huge restrictions on outcomes before the discussion even starts, and that's a terrible place to start when you're trying to build trust and a working relationship that we all have a common interest, that we want our education system to do well and have good outcomes for working families.
We have Ms. Lamoureux with the next question. Or maybe not. Does anybody any other questions from the committee? Mr. Altamir?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The other question that I have, Mr. Rebeck, is I know that specifically we're talking about this particular bill, but you talked about an obsession that this government has with interfering into the negotiation process with workers. Can you talk a little bit about some examples of that, how this government has interfered in a collective bargaining process?
Mr. Rebeck?
Yeah, since 2018, many public sector workers have been unable to bargain, whether that's because of an illegal wage freeze legislation that had to be taken to court to be struck down, the ongoing appeal of a very clear decision by a judge who not only ruled in our favor, but called the actions of government draconian, and then reorganizing, whether it's been in healthcare or now in the education system, that further prolongs agreements that expired in 2018 and have left people frozen with their wages, which really means they're falling behind year after year, not keeping up with inflation for years now. At the same time, we call them heroes because they're on the front lines providing critical services. Well, that's not how people should treat heroes. That's not how government should treat our public sector workers. They deserve to keep up with cost of living, and this government has done changes through law after law to impede the collective bargaining process, and it needs to stop.
We have time for one more question. Ms. Lamoureux has the next question. Ms. Lamoureux, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and I apologize, it got kicked off there with my Wi-Fi. Thank you, Mr. Rebeck, for your presentation and also for taking the time to thank all teachers as well as the staff at the Ledge. Tim and Katerina do a phenomenal job, and I think it's important to recognize them as well. I appreciate you taking the time to explain the toll that would be taken on the contracts if proclamation were to happen when it's set to right now, and the harm that could cause, as well as the ability to pay clause. And I guess I'm just wondering if you feel there are parts of the bill that are worthwhile to keep, or if the entire legislation should be reconsidered.
Mr. Rebeck?
I think this bill is rife with problems. It's all been done in a rush. It hasn't involved teachers and school workers enough in drafting language that would be meaningful and worthwhile. It's very disappointing to see these actions going forward the way they are.
Mr. Rebeck, thank you very much for your presentation. Your time for the question has expired, and again, thank you for coming out to present. We'll now go on to the next presenter, number 16, Mark Bernhardt, private citizen. So I will now ask the moderator to invite him into the meeting, and please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Okay, Mr. Bernhardt, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're holding this committee on Treaty 1 territory and the original homeland of the Métis Nation. Thank you to the committee for being here to listen to my concerns regarding this bill, Bill 45. My name is Mark Barrett. I'm currently in my 10th year of teaching, and I'm a proud member of the Seven Oaks Teachers Association and Manitoba Teachers Society. However, I will be presenting as a private citizen this evening. I registered to speak to Bill 45, the Public Schools Amendment and Manitoba Teachers Society Amendment Act, because I would like to express my concerns with this government's continued effort to suppress bargaining rights for public sector workers in Manitoba. This bill upsets me. I'm not a politician, not an economist, not a lawyer, but I am a voter, and I have lived experience of having my bargaining rights under attack from this government for years. I think that makes me qualified to give you my opinion on this piece of legislation and to be heard in good faith during this process. I certainly hope I will be. Of particular concern to me is 105, 2.1, the criteria for an arbitrator to consider when issuing an arbitration award. And I'd like to read it now. So in making an award, the arbitrator or arbitration board must take into consideration all factors that they consider relevant, including the ability of the school division or school district to pay in light of its fiscal situation and the economic situation in Manitoba. This is an infringement on my charter right to free and fair collective bargaining. Bill 45 is just one of the latest examples in a series of actions by this government to interfere, infringe upon, and limit the collective bargaining rights of teachers. As of right now, I'm one of the people that will be left without a contract from 2018 indefinitely if this comes into force as it is written. I've been without a collective agreement for 2.5 years because of the unconstitutional actions of this government. I would like to outline a couple of them to show a pattern of this behavior. Years ago, Bill 28 was introduced to freeze public sector wages unconstitutionally, and it was struck down decisively by the courts. It was deemed a draconian piece of legislation. From the beginning, I'm sure the government knew their chances were slim that they were going to be successful in legislating this unconstitutional wage freeze. This is why they left it without proclaiming it, to sit in the background, to stall bargaining for teacher contracts, and then wasted taxpayer dollars defending it in court, and they still are. After that loss, I had hoped they would take their lumps, figure out how to properly fund the education system, which includes paying teachers a fair wage, but I was wrong. They continue to attempt to implement this wage freeze today by issuing bargaining mandates to school boards that mirror the wage freeze legislation in Bill 28. Locals took this to arbitration. Then the arbitration board further solidified this government's losing track record on this issue. They ruled that in favor of a modest and fair salary increase for teachers. After that loss, I had hoped they'd take their lumps this time, figure out how to properly fund education, but they still haven't. Instead, they're attempting to move the goalposts now on arbitration with Bill 45. Teachers traded their right to strike in return for binding arbitration rights years ago. Arbitration is the mechanism we have to settle labor disputes. In the recent Louis Riel Teachers Association Arbitration Award, the arbitration board expressed their concerns regarding the ability to pay being considered in this bargaining environment of, quote, government-enforced policies of funding restraint combined with restrictions on local taxation. And further, they stated it may result in them becoming, quote, an agent of government policy, end quote. Taking into account that teachers do not have the legal right to strike, they stated, quote, we should take care to ensure that teacher collective bargaining remains meaningful, end quote. In the same LRTA arbitration award, they reference a 96 arbitration ruling in the River East School Division where they stated, quote, an arbitration board cannot embrace the ideological proposition that a tax increase must be rejected. A decision which is supported solely by the object of avoiding a tax increase is inherently a political decision, end quote. Fair wages are an actual cost of providing public education. It makes no sense for the government to justify fair wages based on this government's own legislative agenda. And this was all in motion before the pandemic and its economic effects. By legislating that arbitrators cannot take into, or must take into account the fiscal situation and economic situation in Manitoba, the government is effectively attempting to open a backdoor to continue to implement their unconstitutional wage freeze. Who sets the policies that determine the fiscal situation of our education system and our province? It sure isn't me. It's not my family or the other teachers and public sector workers in this province. It's this government. This government is continuously underfunding education with funding that does not keep up with the rate of inflation. And then they turn around and say there isn't enough money to pay teachers a fair wage. Well, set the fiscal course for this province in a manner that will allow you to pay fair wages to the hardworking educators in the province. This government spent our tax dollars to fight a losing court battle over Bill 28. Public sector workers aren't responsible for that fiscal choice. That was their priority rather than ensuring educators are paid a fair wage. This government is taking on debt to give tax breaks. And I really don't want to hear about kitchen tables. It's patronizing and it's offensive. I don't need props. The government found the money for these tax breaks that will disproportionately benefit the people with the most land in our province. But at the same time, they're telling us that the fiscal situation in the province is far too dire to pay teachers a fair wage and stay away from interfering in bargaining. I'm tired of listening to this government say they respect teachers and public sector workers, while at the same time, they're stripping our bargaining rights with Bill 45 and wasting tax dollars in other places. Nothing about the demeanor and actions of this government says to public sector workers that they respect our work. I would like to conclude with a quick observation that supports this point. We're currently discussing Bill 45, but this bill serves only as one example of the disrespect this government has for teachers in the province. I want to point out the fact that there are thousands of unvaccinated teachers teaching in overcrowded classrooms in this province during a pandemic. We're there trying our best to ensure the safety of our students during these times. We're trying to follow as many health orders and guidelines that come our way, and if there's additional measures we can take to keep our students safe, we do those too. We don't have a choice. Our students need us right now and we need to keep them healthy. We also worry about keeping our families healthy. We don't want to bring COVID-19 home to our families. But as teachers are doing their best to keep their students safe and their loved ones, members of this government consistently sit there maskless on the floor of the legislature and in press conferences, and the public notices. I know that your rules don't require you to wear masks while seated, but I also know that there are members who have children who attend schools in this province. I'm sure you appreciate teachers doing their best to go over and above to keep your children safe. On behalf of the teachers and essential workers in Manitoba, I would ask you to take Dr. Roussen's advice. Just because it isn't a law or a public health order or the written rules in the legislature doesn't mean that you shouldn't go above and beyond to do as much as you can to limit your risk of contracting and spreading the virus. How hard is it to put on a mask? I do it all day while I'm teaching. God forbid anyone gets COVID in the legislature, but just in case someone does, you have a responsibility as Manitobans to go beyond the minimum guidelines to minimize the risk of transmission. So as you're discussing this bill that has major implications for teacher bargaining rights, as a public school teacher, I'd appreciate it if you reflected on this and showed your respect to essential workers beyond the minimum rules and wear your masks. The teachers and essential workers that come into contact with you and your family and the community would appreciate it. Instead of saying you respect us in question period and press conferences, show us you respect us by wearing a mask, physical distance, and while you're at it, stay away from my bargaining rights. In conclusion, Bill 45 is an attack on the bargaining rights of teachers and serves as another example of how this government does not respect public sector workers. In particular, 105 2.1 at a minimum should be struck from the bill. Thank you for your time. Vaccinate teachers and school staff.
Thanks, Mr. Bernhardt, for your presentation. And now we'll go on to questions from the committee. The Honourable Minister Collin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Brandt, for your insight and your presentation tonight. Thanks.
Noted.
Do you want to respond, Mr. Bernhardt, for the?
I just said noted.
Okay. Mr. Altmaier has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Barrett, for your presentation. Certainly has left us with a lot of food for thought. Certainly a presentation that really brings not only experience of a teacher, but also as a person that has kids in the system. And that is really important to remember. And so I want to ask a question around this particular issue. So thinking as a parent, as a person that has children in the system, we know that teacher working conditions parallel student learning conditions. How do you think Bill 45 will impact this symbiotic relationship?
Mr. Bernhardt?
Well, basically, I think that, it's just another example of the government making this relationship between teachers and the government contentious when it doesn't need to be. And any sort of interference in this, interference in public teachers' rights to labor rights and things like this affect the system as a whole. And it can't be positive. It certainly isn't good for morale. And, as a teacher, that concerns me, but as a father, I'd like my daughter and my son to have teachers that are well respected as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
Ms. Lamoureux has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you, Mr. Barant, for your presentation and for your 10 years of teaching. I'm so sorry that you've been put in this position where you may be without a contract, and I appreciate you sharing this as it really humanizes the legislation. And I personally think your straightforwardness through this presentation has been terrific, and it's refreshing. This is why we have committees, so Manitobans can share their thoughts and their expertise. Now, you mentioned that you have spoken with other teachers about this legislation, so I was hoping that you could share with us if you feel that you were consulted about this legislation, or any of the teachers you have spoken with, if they expressed that they had been consulted.
Mr. Bernhardt?
There's certainly a lack of consultation, all around. And also in particular with this bill. Like I follow these things more often, more so than maybe other people do. But people come to me, my colleagues come to me, ask me, where's my back pay? Why don't we have a contract? Is there bargaining happening? And a lot of people, not only are they not consulted, there's confusion because this has been dragged out for years. And honestly, I wasn't even completely aware of just how many more years this could drag out if this Bill 45 passes. but listening to the other presenters, this is more grave than I actually initially thought. And anytime I show somebody clips of, you know, the responses to questions in question period, it's disrespectful. They find it disrespectful. There's deflection. There's talking points that mean nothing. And people feel disrespected by it. Not only that they're not consulted, but just the demeanor of this government is disrespectful. And by the way, I submit my receipts for reimbursement for school supplies. And I'm lucky enough to have a principal that will make sure that he finds the money to make things happen for our students. And, you know, sometimes we have to be creative, but I don't need a tax break for that. That should be funded by the public school system. But that's an aside.
Bernard, thank you very much for your presentation. Our time has sort of run out, and so now we'll go on to the next. Actually, before we go to the next presenter, actually Kelly Friesen, she was number 12. She had technical difficulties getting onto the Zoom meeting here, the committee meeting. So now she's actually been able to fix. So we just want to have the committee actually be able to agree that we will have her be presenting next. Is it will of the committee to have Kelly Friesen present next? Agreed. So now I'll ask the moderator to invite her into the meeting. And please, Kelly, if you can unmute your and turn on your video. And Kelly Friesen, Ms. Friesen, you can go ahead with your presentation.
All right, thank you. I hope you can hear me. It's just kicked me out and asked me to rejoin a couple of times, but I think
you, Kelly, we can hear you, but we can't see you right now. So hopefully your video will come on soon. Oh, here we go.
Okay, should be good.
Now we can hear you, we can see you. Go ahead.
All right, 2 for 2. Thank you for having me, and thank you for putting up with my various challenges with technology. I guess it's part and parcel for this school year. Challenges with technology have certainly colored the year. I'm fighting with Google on one of my other screens in my Google Classroom while I'm also attending this meeting. So it just seems to be this way this year goes. I'm going to try to be really brief because I do respect the time of everybody who is spending their evening in a committee meeting. And I feel like some of the previous presenters have made a lot of comments that I agree heartily with, in particular, Mr. Beyrent, who just spoke. But I do think it's important that you hear as many voices as possible, even if we have similar things to say. So my concern is also predominantly with the part of Bill 45, Section 105 2.1 about arbitrators taking into account ability to pay. The first thing I thought when I read that was, how does an arbitrator determine ability to pay? Governments, by their very nature, make decisions about taxation and spending. Our current government, for example, is focused on providing tax cuts. How do you determine the ability to make a tax cut? Whether or not the government has the ability to pay is determined by a government's priorities, not so much by external factors. So whether your priorities are tax cuts or settling contracts with public unions or with funding various other things that are important to your government, that's based on priorities. That's not based on an objective sense of ability to pay. The ability to pay clause also refers to school divisions and districts, which I was curious about because that's despite the fact that negotiations in the future, by my understanding, are to be directly with the province. A division or district's ability to pay will therefore be constrained by how much funding the province decides to give them. So again, that's based on political priorities, not necessarily based on some sort of objective measure. A fair process should not be at the mercy of political ideology. Our current government has put forward legislation to handcuff and limit the collective bargaining process through Bill 28. This bill, as many others have mentioned this evening, was declared unconstitutional and has not been proclaimed, and yet the provincial government continues to demand that bargaining adhere to that bill. Teachers gave up the right to strike long ago in return for a fair arbitration process. Bill 45 threatens to undermine that process and take away the good faith that is essential to all negotiations. I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher for 18 years. More importantly, I'm a parent, and I want my kids to have good teachers who are well supported. And I want this government to respect all members of the public system, from nurses to teachers to doctors, to the people who fix our roads, all of them. And I'm not seeing that in the approach of this government on many issues, and it is exemplified in Bill 45. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly, for your presentation. Now we'll go on to questions, and the first question will be coming from the Minister Cullen. Minister Cullen, if you can ask the question.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Friesen, for joining us tonight. Appreciate your perspective. Appreciate the good work you're doing for students. So thanks for joining us tonight.
Mr. Altamar, Ms. Friesen, if you want to respond to the minister, or do you want to go on to the next question?
Nope, no response.
Okay. Mr. Altamar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I beg your indulgence on some of these, because sometimes I have to cool my jets, as they say, in getting in my questions. But, you know, Ms. Friesen, I want to thank you for your presentation this evening. It echoes many of what we've already heard this evening, but you know what? I think this government really needs to listen to not only what the general public is saying, but also to listen to teachers, because not only are you on the front lines, but I find teachers are often the pulse of the community, and certainly reflect many of what the community are feeling and thinking. And you talked about government priorities. So I want to ask you, what do you believe are this current Palliser's government priorities, and how do these priorities impact our public education system?
Ms. Friesen?
Well, it's a funny thing, because academically, I'm a political science major. So I spend a lot of time analyzing what a government's priorities are and where they're coming from. And looking at this government, I don't know. Certainly, policy-wise, the priorities seem to be tax cuts simplistically, but I think the priority is really to undermine the public service in a lot of ways. And what drives that? My guess would be ideology, but I don't really know. I would say the impact, though, on teaching and learning is enormous, and it ranges from the impact on morale, when my colleagues and I get up every day and we wonder what's going to be announced today and how awful is it going to be. And that's literally how that conversation is being framed. Nobody is asking what's going to be announced today and will it be good or bad. It's framed as how bad will it be? How much is it going to hurt my students? How much is it going to hurt me as an educator? How much is it going to limit my ability to find the resources I need from my students? How much is it going to constrain how many books I can put in my classroom or in our library? How much is it going to constrain my ability to talk about what this government has termed sensitive content? And how is that going to hurt my students who are labeled sensitive content? So yeah, the overall tone is one of what harm is being done. And as an educator, I spend a lot of time wondering, how am I going to try to mitigate that harm for my students?
Okay, we have one more question, enough time for one more question. Ms. Lamoureux for the next question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you, Ms. Friesen, for your presentation, your time tonight, as well as your work as a teacher. And speaking from the perspective of both a teacher and a parent, I can relate to you as a political science major myself, and overanalyzing all of this legislation and the approach to it. And just a similar question that I've been asking other presenters on this committee is just if you feel that you have been consulted about this legislation, about anything in buildup that may have contributed towards this legislation, or any of your teacher colleagues or your friends within the education system.
Ms. Friesen?
No, I don't. I don't think that most teachers feel like we have been consulted. I know a lot of words have been spoken about consultation and through an Engage Manitoba, and I submitted to Engage Manitoba. And going beyond whether or not I've been consulted, I've gone out of my way, and I don't have a lot of time. I have kids, and I'm putting in a lot of extra hours this year, as many people are in their jobs. But when I have sent letters or emails to Minister Cullen or to other representatives, I don't always even get responses back. I get responses back from both opposition parties, but I have not received responses from Minister Collin or the previous minister, Minister Gertsen.
Well, thanks, Ms. Friesen, for your presentation and answering these questions. And now now that we're concluded on the ones that were listed, we brought people down to the bottom when their names came up. So we're going to go back to those names one by one and to see if they're still in presence. So the next person that would be on the list would be Jan McIntyre. If Jan McIntyre, she's on now? Okay. Now we will. I'll have the moderator invite her into the meeting, and now if she can unmute herself and turn her video on. Ms. McIntyre. Ms. McIntyre, can you unmute yourself? Oh.
Yes. Am I unmuted now, sir?
Hear you now.
Good. Thank you. I'm just drawing up my document here. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening, committee members. My name is Jan McIntyre. I'm the chairperson of the Board of Trustees of Prairie Spirit School Division, located in the south central part of the province. Today, I'm speaking to you on behalf of our school board. And I would like to add that although I speak to you on behalf of the board, our children were educated here in Prairie Spirit schools, and I'm also the grandmother of students within our school division. So my investment is great in education in our communities. Much of Bill 45 will be nullified if Bill 64 goes ahead. My remarks this evening are therefore much shorter as a result of the introduction of Bill 64. As a rural school board, our concerns with Bill 45 are related to our understanding of its negative effects on rural education in Manitoba. Our concern has to do with the lack of local autonomy and voice. As a school board, we have a good working relationship with our teachers and share mutual respect, each understanding and appreciating the role of the other in the school division and in the bargaining process. It is our shared desire to work together for the betterment of Prairie Spirit students that is our unifying force, be that in the everyday work we do and at the bargaining table. We feel there are factors beyond dollars and working conditions that are discussed when bargaining. Things such as nuances relative to our schools and communities and how the schools function within those particular communities. Two-way understanding is built as these issues are discussed and relationships are strengthened. This then leads to very important shared accountability and trust on both sides. This trust and accountability will be gone with provincial bargaining and will be replaced instead with a more distant provincial structure that will ultimately be divisive and adversarial for all. We feel this is an expensive price to pay for a system that will in all likelihood increase costs overall. I would also like to address briefly the difficulty in attracting rural students to rural teachers, to rural Manitoba, and the inability of the provincial collective bargaining to address that issue, as well as to address the challenges rural teachers face that are real but different than those of their urban counterparts. We feel there needs to be a mechanism in place that allows for negotiation of small but important local issues. Thank you for your time this evening.
Thanks, Ms. McIntyre, for your presentation. And now we'll go on to questions. We'll start with Minister Collin. Mr. Collin, if you can start first.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Jan, for joining us tonight. I appreciate your perspective, and also appreciate your passion for education as well. So thanks for joining us. Do appreciate your opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Collin.
Ms. McIntyre, go ahead if you want.
Thank you.
Okay. Next question would be Mr. Altamar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. McIntyre, for your presentation, and thank you again for bringing a perspective that is, again, outside the perimeter highway, one that we here in the legislature need to hear more of. I know that sometimes we certainly don't get these opportunities that often, and you brought a perspective that's important. I want to ask you, Ms. McIntyre, talk about some of the challenges that Prairie Spirit has had to overcome during this time of COVID, and talk about how it's impacted students in your school division.
Ms. McIntyre.
Thank you, Mr. Altemeyer. Prairie Spirit is a very sparsely populated school division. And so we have relied on distance education as a tool to bridge distance for several years now. We started with our distance education plan probably in 1998, and we've extended it and grown it over time so that now it's proven to be very effective. With the COVID pandemic, our students and our staff were therefore prepared for using technology, and it was a relatively seamless transition for them. Not easy, back in the spring of last year when everyone was at home, but it was doable for the vast majority of our grades 7 to 12 students. This year, our superintendent and secretary treasurer have worked extremely hard in consultation with the board and with our divisional administrative staff to meet the requirements, the public health guidelines that are put in place. And we are one of the few school divisions in Manitoba that have been able to have our students in classes daily, with the exception of the 2-week period in January that was everybody was at home.
Okay, any other questions? I don't know if Miss Lamoureux is, she's having issues with her, yeah. Any other questions? Ms. McIntyre, thanks again for your presentations, and it's great that you were here tonight to present and probably run into you. I know you're from you represent part of my constituency of Turtle Mountain, so thank you for coming out.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Now we'll go on to the go on the list again. And I was wondering, next person I'm going to call is Sandy Lethbridge. Is Sandy Lethbridge on the line? No. We'll actually remove her from the list now. And I guess the next person is Lise Legal. Is Legal? Lise Legal. Is she on the line? Okay. I'll get the moderator to let her in, and if you can unmute your sound and turn on your video. Hi, Ms. Legel. You can go ahead with your presentation. I think we have some audio problems.
Hello. Yeah, we're good? Yes?
Yeah,
Thank you for pronouncing my name correctly. Lise Legal here. Thank you. Okay, sorry, there's my notes. Okay. So again, my name is Lise Legal, and I am currently the president of the Pembina Trails Teachers Association. And I've been actually working in the public education system since 1988. And so before I start, I do want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory and that on the homeland of the Métis Nation. And thank you for listening. So with those 33 years of being in the public education system, I've been on the front line with children and with educators, of course, and we've faced challenges in support of teachers and education. And we have been, there have been not many bystanders, and I'm not a bystander, because I was raised to believe that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good citizens to do nothing. And so here I'm raising my voice today, and I know that that quote has had a number of authors. I know one of them is Edmund Burke, to be respectful. I want to acknowledge that. And so Bill 45, although not evil in and of itself, will have evil consequences. And the ability to pay is at the top of the list of the things that are going, in my mind, going to have some evil consequences. And forcing arbitrators to consider the ability to pay by the division, the employer, and also to consider the provincial economic status has been proven in the courts to actually be a willingness to pay. And this is not new information. You've heard it all night, and you know it yourselves. And so we know that the Manitoba government is in charge of properly funding public education. They have the methods to do so. They control the spending, the taxation, all those things. They make the choices, and they must properly fund education. Those choices must properly fund education. To suggest that arbitrators need to consider economic conditions is actually a clear sign that the provincial government is shirking their responsibility to properly fund public education. And that's one of the jobs of government, to properly fund public services. Bill 45 will damage schools, communities, and further erode teacher working conditions and negatively impact salaries. Also, forcing arbitrators to think on the ability to pay interferes with our charter right to free and fair collective bargaining. Considering the ability to pay means that arbitrators will essentially be agents of government. They will no longer be impartial. Educators will have lost the essence of the dispute resolution mechanism of interest arbitration. And this will exacerbate power imbalances in collective bargaining and will result in reducing the leverage available to educators during bargaining. Another important concern involves the fact that the raw data that would be used to determine the ability to pay includes financial information and reports provided by a government who has been called out by the Auditor General for making creative financial representations. That's about the worst thing I'm going to say today. This fact does little to inspire confidence on behalf of educators and any other Manitobans, really. To that point, Bill 28 is another example of the type of sustained interference that this majority government uses to prevent fair, reasonable contract relationships between educators and the school division. If Bill 45 passes, Manitoba will not be protecting children, families, communities, and will not be inspiring young people to join the profession of teaching. This whole process of bills, 45, 16, 64, 57, et cetera, they all demoralize and discourage. They demoralize and discourage educators and families who are struggling through a pandemic. Educators, students, families who have been turning themselves inside out and upside down to make it through another day in the overcrowded, underfunded schools that may or may not have COVID. In a pandemic, that was actually the way I was supposed to say it. Years ago, educators gave up the right to strike for interest arbitration. That is our dispute resolution mechanism. It is supposed to render a fair and reasonable award. Bill 45 and the ability to pay provision compromises this. Interest arbitration has helped Manitoba have significant labor peace, and not all Canadian jurisdictions can say this. But in Manitoba, educators have been able to do their work. Students have been able to grow and to learn. Year after year, the school system has functioned. Not perfectly, perhaps, but there are many aspects that are working. And top of that list are the relationships. The relationships are really working. And the primary interface of those relationships are the teachers. They deserve respect, healthy working conditions, and fair, reasonable salaries. The relationships mentioned are the core of public education. They're built on trust, commitment, community, hard work, integrity, all kinds of things. And Bill 45 compromises all of those, and therefore compromises relationships. There are so many bills from this government that threaten the health and vibrancy of public schools, and it needs to stop. Returning to Bill 28, this government needed the courts to intervene in that terrible piece of legislation. How many more pieces of legislation will be allowed to come from this government that threaten public education? Public education is a foundation for equity, for social justice, and for a vibrant future for all Manitobans. The fallout of Bill 45 will reverberate for decades at minimum. The cumulative damage of this bill to young people, educators, and to our society is incalculable. I close by stating the obvious. It is far more productive to prevent this harm than it is to try to help children and educators and Manitobans recover from it. I urge this government to close the door on this destructive bill. We cannot continue to wait for the courts to intervene on behalf of Manitoba's public education system and on behalf of all the children, educators, and families. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ms. Legel, for your presentation. And now we'll go on to questions. And the Honourable Minister Collin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Legel, for your presentation tonight. I do appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. So thank you very much.
The next question would be Mr. Altamar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Ms. Legel, for your presentation this evening. You talked a lot about the public good, and that relationship between government and teachers is one that is sacred, one that really talks about the importance of having a good relationship, but also understanding each other's needs. Can you tell us a little bit about how important it is to have interest arbitration unfettered by the ability to pay?
Ms. Legel.
Thank you. In fact, we just finished, as everybody knows, the Pembina Trails Teachers Association just finished our interest arbitration hearings in January, and the award was presented on February 15th. And I can tell you that the ability to pay came up a few times, or at least conversations about the ability to pay, and it was dismissed every time. And so if that, I know that if those kinds of, if that kind of rationale was permitted in that arbitration, the result, not just in salaries, but in contract language would have been different, because we would not have had the opportunity to leverage the things that go on between money and working conditions and contract language. Does that make sense?
We have another question from Mr. Altamar. I don't see Ms. Lamoureux. Okay, Mr. Altamar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Lamoureux, I apologize, Ms. Legel. Ms. Legel, you talked about being demoralized and discouraged. What would this government need to do to mitigate the feeling that you have regarding being demoralized and discouraged?
Ms. Legel.
And to clarify, I don't know if I said I feel demoralized or discouraged. My intention was to express that it is demoralizing and discouraging to see these types of legislation come out and to not be included in the party before all of the things come to fruition, or to give the impression that we're being included. We need meaningful conversations on these matters that impact teachers. I go to the hospital and I have an experience in the hospital. That doesn't make me able to decide on what doctors should be doing. And it is very difficult. One of the common things that I hear in my role is that there are a number of people making decisions about education who have been students or maybe have been teachers like 20 years ago. But I can tell you that being a teacher 1 month ago is not the same as being a teacher now. The evolution and the dynamics in school systems, even before COVID, changed at an alarming rate. And so we're professionals, we're trained, we have a great deal of experience. So we would like to be included in the decisions that affect our work, our children, our careers, the schools, the families we work with.
Okay, is there any other questions for Ms. Legel? No other questions? Thanks, Ms. Legel, for your presentation and answering these questions. So now we'll continue on the list of other presenters that we put down at the list. Is Nancy Karpinski, is she on the line? No, so I will remove her. She is on the line. She is on the line. Okay, well now I'll have the moderators allow Nancy to come on to the meeting, and I'll have Nancy to unmute herself and turn her video on. Okay, Ms. Karpinski, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your time, allowing me to be here to speak. My name is Nancy Karpinski. I've been an educator for the last 19 years, and for the past 6 years spent in school administration as vice principal and principal. And my experience has primarily been with French immersion context. So my primary concern with Bill 45, and the reason that I registered to present, this is my first time ever presenting to a committee, is the ability to pay clause, which we have heard multiple people talk about already. So this clause, if maintained, will without a doubt negatively impact teachers' salaries, benefits, and working conditions. And equally as important, the ability to attract new quality teachers to the profession in Manitoba, in particular within the French immersion sector. The French immersion sector is a very highly competitive sector in education across Canada. And we are in competition, really, for those teachers with other provinces across the country. In my current school, I hired 4 new French immersion teachers this year, and 3 out of the 4 came from out of province. The attraction to teaching in Manitoba, our working conditions, our benefits, and our salaries, and the trust and respect that teachers receive from the general public. Trust and respect, I fear, that we don't actually feel at present from this government. I think I heard from Mr. Weens and a few of the other presenters say something similar, but the term ability to pay is misleading and could potentially lead public to believe that the cost of educating our youth is just too high of a price to pay. Why is it misleading? Well, because it is you, the province, that sets the dollar amount that you are willing, not able, but willing to spend on education. It is you that determines the spending priorities within the province. So you decide if education funding is a priority and how much of a priority it is. It is you that determines the price you're willing to pay to educate our youth. If I make $2,000 and my rent is $1,000 and I go to my landlord at the end of the month and say, sorry, I just don't have the ability to pay this month, it's simply not true. The truth is I prioritized my spending on something else and only left $800 to pay for the rent. It's not that I didn't have the ability to pay, it's that I chose to spend it somewhere else. That's the ability to pay clause in a nutshell. As you all know, I'm sure, a critical piece of a fair system of bargaining is an unbiased, independent arbitration policy. The arbitration process is the only dispute resolution process available to teachers during bargaining. We gave up the right to strike in the best interest of our students. We know how disruptive a strike would be to their education. We know how disruptive a strike would be to their parents, to business, to industry. We can all look to the pandemic school closures over the past year as an example of how disruptive it is to daily life when schools close. And we gave up that right to strike, and in turn, you, the government, agreed to a fair arbitration process. It is absolutely imperative that this process remain as such, and that this clause is amended or removed to show that. I work in a division where we haven't had a contract in, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, not really even sure at this point anymore how long it's been. And we're not the only division. And again, I think it speaks to priorities and values and willingness. And it speaks to devaluing of an educator's worth. And it's this devaluing that doesn't fill any of us with any measure of confidence that if this bill passes as is, without a fair system of arbitration, that we'd somehow be valued more. And to be perfectly honest, it seems in stark contrast to the rhetoric we've heard daily, weekly, about how grateful this government is for the work of teachers throughout the pandemic. But I'll end just by saying that as a principal, the recruitment and hiring of teachers is an incredibly important part of my job. It is a critical decision when I hire somebody. And the level of competition across the country for French immersion teachers is at an all-time high. This bill will handcuff my ability to recruit quality teachers to our Manitoban schools. And I don't think that this is any time for our government to be making decisions that make our province a less attractive place to work for teachers. And to me, That's what this bill does. In particular, the ability to pay clause. So I thank you for your time, and I wish you all the best in your deliberations and your
Thanks,
further
Ms.
discussion.
Karpinski, for your presentation. Now we'll go on to questions. The Honourable Minister Cullen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Karpinski, for your comments on Bill 45. I also appreciate your comments in terms of French immersion and acquiring French immersion teachers. I'll just say earlier this week, I had a meeting with our Francophone minister, as well as the federal minister for French language services. And our conversation was exactly about that. How can we attract additional French immersion, French language teachers to our province? So it's certainly one of those things that are top of mind for us. So I just wanted to share that with you. And thank you for your comments, and thanks for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
Ms. Karpinski, I don't know if you want to respond or have it up.
Well, I don't know if you can answer, but I would definitely be curious about what those recruitment plans involve from the province to get more French immersion teachers.
Oh, the Honourable...
Probably not an answer or a question
okay.
for right now, but...
I want to know if the Honourable Minister wants to reply to that.
Sure, I'll just be brief. You know, obviously, I think there's a lot of work ahead. It sounds like there's potentially some federal legislation coming that may assist in that endeavor. So we're waiting to see what that looks like, and we'll continue to work on that issue because we do know it's an issue here in Manitoba. So thanks for raising that.
Mr. Altmer for the next question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Karpinski, for your presentation. And that was pretty smooth for a first-time presenter, and certainly you filled us in a lot about, you know, the important role that vice principals and principals play in the process of recruiting qualified professional staff. I want to say when I was a school principal, that was my number one concern, and certainly my number one job, to ensure that I had the proper people in the classroom. Can you talk a little bit about how difficult it has been for a school division with the reputation of Louis Riel in an urban setting to attract properly qualified French immersion teachers to the city of Winnipeg?
Ms. Karpinski.
Yeah, first I'm in Winnipeg School Division. I'm not in Louis Riel. It is, we have every year and I mean, it's not just our division, it's all of the divisions that are out recruiting. We send a recruitment team of principals or vice principals to several job fairs across Canada. We go to Ontario, we go to Quebec, we go, sometimes we go way out east to New Brunswick, to job fairs or new grad fairs from the universities to recruit out of province teachers. We also attend the ones that are here in town, but there's not enough teachers for the demand in French immersion. And it's not just a question of, okay, if there's 20 jobs, you want to find 20 teachers. You want there to be a bit of a competition for the jobs so that you can have the best person, not just a body, but the best teacher in the position and the best fit of teacher in that position. And that's the tough part. It's, you know, if I post an English job, I have 10 people apply for it. 10 quality teachers that I get to really make a decision. If I post a French immersion job, I'm calling all my colleagues to say, hey, do you have anybody that teaches grade 4 or 5 French immersion or whatever that position may be? So it is very difficult, and we rely a lot on each other to, you know, word of mouth. I have a good teacher here if you have a position coming up, but it's not easy. And it certainly isn't ideal for the profession nor for the children.
Well, Ms. Karpinski, thank you very much for your time. We run out of for questions, and thanks for presenting tonight, and thanks for coming out. So now we'll go on to the last two that were brought to the bottom of the line, And I was wondering if Sean Giesbrecht is he on the line right now? No. So we'll remove Sean Giesbrecht from the line. And now the last one that was moved down to the bottom of the list was Greg Walker. Is Greg Walker around? No? So that's basically, Greg Walker will be taken off the list too. And that will basically conclude the list of presenters that we have here before us. In what order does the committee wish to proceed with clause by? Oh, there's only one bill. Okay. So. Okay. Now we're going to proceed with clause by clause for this Bill 45. Does the minister does the minister have a response to Bill 45 and have an opening statement?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief. I know the clock is ticking this evening. So first of all, I do want to thank all of our presenters tonight. Clearly, we had a lot of presenters showing a lot of passion for education. And I thank them for their thoughtful presentations and joining us tonight. I think it would be remiss if I didn't take an opportunity to again acknowledge the teachers, principals, and certainly all the staff that have been working so hard over the past year as we fight the COVID pandemic. I know teaching can be a challenging profession at the best of times. And obviously this whole pandemic has brought additional challenges to the floor. So I just want to acknowledge everyone for the work that they're doing in terms of keeping our children safe and keeping our staff safe as well. And there is a lot of people involved in that. And just say hang in there, and we'll hope we can continue to get some vaccines in arms and take some of the pressure off, and just wish them all the best for the couple of months that are left in the school year. And certainly we are going to be here to support them over that next phase. And certainly we've set aside some money in our budget for next year as well, in terms of making sure we're have the resources to combat COVID. So with that, I just wanted to put those few words on the record. Again, thanks to all the presenters tonight, and thanks those that sent submissions as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We thank the minister. Does the critic of the official opposition have an opening statement? Mr. Altamar, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the presenters, all the committee members, all the committee members that were virtual today, for being here for this important bill and to deliberate in committee. I will say that the minister talked about the challenges that are facing educators, and yet this is yet another challenge, another roadblock put by this government in front of educators, and one that really speaks to the consistent attack that educators, the school system, has been under. It started with Bill 16, Bill 45, Bill 64, and even went back to Bill 28, and I can go back to Bill 72 25 years ago. The same consistent attack on the rights of workers to collaborate, to collectively bargain a fair and equal settlement. And that's what seems to be lost here. Every one of our presenters this evening talked about the ability to pay clause and the hamstringing this will impart on our education system. Not only will it impact our educators, it certainly impacts our students. Because as one of the presenters said, teacher working conditions have a direct correlation to student learning conditions. And once we know that this is a symbiotic relationship, I'm sure someone in government understands that, but yet we have bill after bill after bill that attempts to mute the voices of workers and attempts to certainly sideline dissenting voices and opinion. And this is not a way to govern. And what we have here with Bill 45 is yet again a power grab by this government that is exemplified not only in Bill 45, but we'll move on to Bill 64. And here we have a theme of disrespect, a theme that certainly demoralizes and certainly has teachers thinking, holy mackerel, what have we done to be in the crosshairs of this government? And that, I believe, is a legitimate question, one that needs to be answered. Because as we sit here, bill after bill after bill, taking all of these initiatives against the important work that our public school educators and all that work in education have done, and yet what do we get? We're called, oh, we're the front line, we're doing the best job, and we value what you do. And yet, how are we rewarded? How are we thanked for the jobs that we do? We're thanked by these bills that are contrary to what's coming out of their mouths. And I just can't sit here anymore as a former educator and tolerate the stuff that we've been receiving. I will say that we are in strong opposition of this bill. This bill does nothing to improve the relationship, the important relationship that government has to uphold the public good being public education. That's being lost here. And this is yet another bill that challenges that, and one that certainly the Manitoba NDP and myself will not support. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I conclude my remarks.
We thank the member. During the consideration of the bill, the enacting clause and the title are postponed until all other clauses have considered for the proper order. Also, there will be agreement that the committee and the chair will call clause in blocks to conform to pages, with the understanding that we will stop at a particular clause or clauses where members may have comments, questions, or amendments to propose. Is that agreed? Agreed, so ordered. Okay, we'll now start with clause by clause. Shall clauses 1 through 3 pass? Clauses 1 through 3 are accordingly passed. Shall clause 4 pass? Clauses 4 is accordingly passed. Shall clauses 5 through 10 pass? Clauses 5 through 10 are accordingly passed. Shall clause 11 pass? Clause 11 is accordingly passed. Shall clauses 12 through 14 pass? Clauses 12 through 14 are accordingly passed. Shall clauses 15 and 16 pass? Clauses 15 and 16 are accordingly passed. Shall clauses 17 through 19 pass? No, I hear no. Mr. Altamar?
Thank you, Mr. Oh, sorry.
So 17 pass? No. So we'll go on to, Mr. Altamar on clause 17.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to speak to clause 17. I've said it before, Mr. Chair, and I'll say it again. Clause 17 interferes in the collective bargaining process. Anytime you insert the ability to pay, that completely clouds the process and completely renders the process mute. And so therefore, we would like clause 17 removed.
Is there any other comments on removing clause 17? Any other comments on that? No, there's no other. Shall clause 17 pass? No, I hear no. All those in favor of the clause 17 pass say yay. Yay. All those opposed, yay. Please say nay.
Nay.
In my opinion, the yeas have it. So clause 17 pass. Or
pass.
Okay. So clauses 18 pass.
Pass.
Clause 18 is accordingly passed. Shall 19 pass? Clause pass. 19 is accordingly passed. Shall clauses 20 through 23 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 20 through 23 are accordingly passed. Shall clause 24 pass?
Pass.
Clause 24 is accordingly passed. Shall clauses 25 and 26 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 25 and 26 are accordingly passed. Shall clause 27 pass?
Pass.
Clause 27 is accordingly passed. Shall the clauses 28 through 30 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 28 through 30 are accordingly passed. Shall the enacting clause pass?
Pass.
The enacting clause is accordingly passed. Shall the title be passed?
Pass.
The title is accordingly passed. Shall the bill be reported?
Agreed.
Agreed, and the bill shall be reported. The hour being 8:55, is the will What is the will of the committee? Rise, agreed? So ordered. The committee rise.